I'm making a mess up here. I wanted to say thank you to whoever dropped these up here. You heard me last night and brought some extras. So I appreciate it. I have one using it. So I wanted you to know that I was thankful for it. Sacrificing in love. That is our topic for this time. And again, it's good to be with you. And many of the faces I recognize from last night, so it's good to see you back. And hope you got a little bit of rest. And to the new faces out there, glad that you're with us on this Saturday morning. I know Saturdays are busy days often. They're the time to get, housework done, chores done around the yard and such, so the day is not letting itself to that kind of thing too awful much, but you're here, and that says great things about you. Willingness to come and to study, so thankful for that. I don't know what I did to your preacher. He gave me a 4-chapter text and then a 3-chapter text, and I'm going to have to repent in sackcloth and ashes. Maybe the sourdough bread my wife brought will help out a little bit. I don't know. No, I joke. It's all right. It's the way the book has divided. We're, in this hour, going to be working through chapters 8, 9, and 10. And so last night, we were running the Indianapolis 500. Tonight, this afternoon, morning, whatever it is, we're going to be just dealing with the Daytona. We're going to move a little bit slower than those F1 cars. We're going to do NASCAR. How about that? In John 13, 34 and 35, a new commandment I give to you, Jesus says, that you love one another. As I've loved you, that you also love one another, and by this shall all men know that you are my disciples. The evidence to the world of the kingdom being the kingdom, Jesus says, at least in part, is going to be the way in which you love each other. Now, loving one another in an agape, sacrificial, you first, me second kind of way doesn't necessarily come naturally. It doesn't necessarily come to us as just a first nature kind of thing. It's a learned behavior. We, from our youth, have to be taught to be willing to share and to be kind and considerate to others, don't we? If you grew up in a home with siblings, you know that to be very, very true. I have 3 younger siblings. I was the oldest. And if you're the oldest, those of you in this room, how many oldest kids do I have in this room? All right, a bunch. You know how it goes, right? Doesn't matter what happens in the house, it's your fault, right? You're the oldest. You should have been watching. You should have been paying attention. You should have been doing something. Your sibling needs help. You need to help them. They need some extra food. You need to take care of them. You're the oldest, right? You have a certain level of responsibility. And our parents have to ingrain that in us, to be willing to share and to be considerate and to think of one another. Because, let's be honest, kids left to themselves often, not always, but often tend to only think about themselves. What's in front of them, what they want, what they need. Well, babes in Christ can sometimes be the same way. Sometimes as we come out of the world into the church, we haven't left behind that selfishness that we learn living apart from Christ. Because when we live apart from Christ, what are we really doing? We're living for ourselves. My lust, my pleasure, my desire, my way, right? I'm going to do what I want to do. And in our society, maybe we should phrase it, I'm going to get mine, right? That's kind of how people talk about it. I'm going to get mine. I'm going to take care of it. But what Paul in these chapters of 8, 9, and 10 is imploring the brethren to do is to be willing to lay aside themselves, to sacrifice for one another, and to do that in love. And so let's look at this first portion of our study, chapter 8, verses 1 through 13, and the idea of sacrificing for my brother. Now, like last night, we're not going to be able to look at every single verse in the text. So we're just not going to be able to do it. We don't have the time to do it. But let's understand a few primary principles from this chapter. First, Paul says, love edifies. Notice the first 3 verses. Now, concerning things offered to idols. As Brother Kevin mentioned, this is one of those times where we evidently have the information. A question has been asked, but we don't have the question. Concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And if anyone thinks he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. Now, I mentioned I'm using the New King James. ESV here phrases, puts the all of us possess knowledge into quotation marks. And then in the next verse, when it says this knowledge puffs up, it places knowledge again in quotation marks to indicate the translator's belief that what Paul is referencing here is something the Corinthians are saying. So in relationship to the things offered to idols, well, we all know. We all understand. But obviously they don't. There's a problem and there's division in the church as a result of it. Knowledge is always going to be dependent on its source. Not all knowledge is good knowledge, right? If you're familiar with the internet at all, and most of us I'm sure are these days, right? The memes that go around don't always have truth in them, especially in the political sphere. Over the last many years, it's become extremely common from both the left and the right of the political spectrum for memes to be placed out with some statistic, some reference point that actually has no validity. It's referencing something that isn't true, hasn't happened. There's no truth at all to it. And then it gets shared, and it gets shared, and it gets shared, and it gets all of these impressions, meaning people looking at it, millions upon millions of times sometimes. And it doesn't matter that it's not true because all those people looking at it thought it was true because it looked true, and so now they believe it to be true. And imagine what they're doing offline. I read that, I believe it's true, I share it, I never see anything to tell me otherwise, I go home and I'm telling my wife about it. I'm sitting at Hardee's on Saturday morning with my friends, and now I'm telling them about it. And unless I run into somebody along the way who knows better, who actually knows the truth, I'm going to keep on living thinking that what I read was true because I didn't take time to actually examine whether it was true. Not all knowledge is good knowledge. Paul's concerned about them having a certain kind of knowledge that puffs up. And this kind of knowledge, the knowledge says, idols aren't nothing, it's no big deal, we're not going to worry about the food. But that isn't always how my brothers and sisters see it. Sometimes what I understand isn't the full picture, and how I'm applying my understanding isn't actually helpful. And so Paul says, but love edifies. He's not diminishing knowledge, because knowledge here that he's talking about is a haughty, puffed up knowledge. We think we know well and better and good, and we don't need anything else on this. Paul says that kind of knowledge is no good. But love edifies. Love builds up. Now, how does it do that? As we go through the rest of this section, what we see is love edifies because love gives consideration to my brother and sister. Love takes knowledge and places it into an actual context of saying, well, idols are nothing, but how does that incorporate with how I am to love my brother or sister who struggles with idols being something still, having some slight significance? Even if I know they're not a god, I just the very idea of an idol makes me sick to my stomach. How do we deal with that? Well, love edifies. That's the first three verses, but Paul goes on to say, yes, idols are nothing, verses 4 through 6. Therefore, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world. There's no other God but one. Idols are nothing. God is one. Think about the Hebrew Shema, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5. Hear, O Israel, Lord our God, He is one, right? Paul references that same idea here with the Corinthians. The idols are nothing. God is one. And he says there is only one God and one Father, verse 5. And in verse 6, there's also only one Lord in Jesus Christ. And concerning the God and Father, he says everything is from Him and we are for God. And then in verse 6, with relationship to Jesus, he says there's one Lord and everything is through Him. So that means you and I are created for God, and we were created through Jesus Christ. So when you look at an idol, where's an idol figure into that? Where do these false gods figure into that? If everything created is from God, and we were created through Jesus Christ, and it's all for God, by the way, where does an idol picture into that? Paul says we can all understand, yes, idols are nothing. That they're meaningless, that they have no value at all. But idols aren't the only thing that's nothing. Food is nothing. Verses 7 and 8. However, there is not in everyone that knowledge, for some, with consciousness of the idol until now, eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Here's the real issue. Here's where the knowledge issue comes into play. There are brethren saying, idols are nothing, it doesn't matter, just eat the food. But there's some brethren who just came out of whatever they came out of, and they just cannot separate the idol from the food. And so you have some brethren with this knowledge puffed up saying, we all know the truth. And yes, does that brother eating whose conscience is being offended know the truth that idols are nothing? Yes, he knows that. But it doesn't mean he's not struggling with it. Not struggling with the truth that the idol is nothing, but struggling with the fact that by eating this, am I partaking in the idol still? Sometimes through the years, we've had brethren back home come out of denominationalism, maybe a very devout kind of faith in the system that they were part of. And there have been aspects of that as they come over to the body, they struggle with certain things. Certain holiday celebrations, for instance. Birthdays, and even to a degree saying, well, should we really be celebrating that kind of stuff? But we had a family in the congregation at one point that, because they had been attached to non-institutionalism in the churches of Christ for so long, that we used to, at potluck Sundays, the closing prayer, have a prayer for the food as part of the closing prayer. Just all right, brother, you're up there. We're going to eat when we're done. Just go ahead and thank God for all worship and thank Him for the food. You know what? We had to stop. Because that brother or sister said, I understand that you aren't trying to blend the two together, but it still bothers me. But we could have said, don't you know there's nothing wrong with eating? You just need to get over it. That's not what we did. We said, okay, there's no harm in drawing a clear distinction and soothing this brother or sister's conscience here. So we had a closing prayer. We get the food all set up, and then the sisters say, okay, everything's good to go, and then one of us leads a prayer for the food. Didn't hurt us at all. An extra prayer ain't going to hurt anybody. But it soothed their conscience, allowed us to understand where they were coming from. They're eating this food and their conscience is offended because all they can think about is the worship to the idol. And if you're fresh out of that kind of paganism, maybe you can appreciate that, right? That they still attach these two together. And so Paul says then, verse 8, but food does not commend us to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, nor if we do not eat are we the worse. He says food doesn't matter. He says it doesn't matter whether you eat this food or you don't. What matters is your brother's conscience is being defiled. It's being corrupted. The word literally carries the idea of being dirtied or soiled. And so verses 9 through 13 then Paul says what matters is my brother. What matters is my brother. He says, beware lest somehow this liberty of yours becomes a stumbling block to those who are weak. You know, there's a parallel chapter to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. That's Romans chapter 14. So I would encourage you in your own time to study these two side by side. I knew I had 3 chapters to go through, so we couldn't do that. But look at Romans chapter 14, just briefly, verse 21. Where Paul says, to those brethren, it is good neither to eat meat nor drink wine nor do anything by which your brother stumbles or is made offended or is made weak. Why? Because my brother matters. If it is something that doesn't matter one way or the other before God, God has said we ought to gather on the first day of the week and we ought to partake of the Lord's Supper. If someone coming out of Catholicism says, oh man, every time we partake of the Lord's Supper, all I can think about is that wrong Mass, and so I can't partake of the Lord's Supper. Now that's a problem, right? That's something commanded by the Lord that commends us to the Lord. That's something of a unique and different status. That's where we've got to say, no, brother, sister, we've got to bring you along here. You've got to understand this isn't the Mass. This is the remembrance of the body and the blood of the Redeemer, and the church gathers together to partake of it. This is different. This isn't that. But when it comes to things that don't matter before God as matters of right or wrong, they're not going to commend us to God or condemn us before God. Paul says we need to give consideration to our brother, lest we cause him to stumble. Verse 10, for if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, Will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? It says he sees you and you're there and they're selling the food, and so you grab it up and you're eating it, and it's no big deal to you because you know it doesn't matter, but they see it and they say, well, I'll do that too because they're strong in the faith, and you cause their conscience to be defiled. He says the strong has to be mindful of what they do and how it will or will not persuade the weak to violate their conscience, to cause them to stumble. And how serious does Jesus take this idea of stumbling? Well, read verse 11. And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died? But when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. You know, Jesus in Matthew 18 said it this way, verses 6 and 7, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to the man by whom the offenses come. What's Paul saying? He's saying to the brethren, don't be the one who brings the offense for your brother. Don't be the one who causes him to sin, because when that happens, you're sinning against Christ. Sacrificing for my brother. So what do I need to do, Paul? How should I approach this in the instance of a weak brother? Therefore, verse 13, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat lest I make my brother stumble. It is better to sacrifice my right to eat that meat than it is to cause my brother to stumble. There are times that we need to choose a different path in a matter of discretion for the sake of our brother or sister in Christ. There are times where we need to abstain from certain things for the sake of our brothers and sisters in Christ. We need to be willing to sacrifice our right. Well, let me tell you about one of those rights that we have. We value so much as Americans, the right to say what I want to say. Call it freedom of speech, right? And we view that in relationship to the government and saying, well, the government can't tell us not to say this or not to say that. That's absolutely right. When I was growing up, we had a certain rule. You can say what you want to say, but don't be surprised if you say it to the wrong person and get punched in the face. That's how we talked about it. You can say whatever you want to say to anybody you want to say it to, but some people are going to punch you in the face when you say it to them. That was what we were told. That's what we were taught. That's kind of what we grew up around. Now, I hope in the church we're not punching each other in the face. But I mention that to say sometimes we think we can just do what we do in culture and society without regard for our brother and sister. Talk about politics for a moment. I imagine folks in this room probably have some strong opinions on certain political matters and political candidates, perhaps, in previous election cycle, how things did or didn't turn out. I'm part of a very diverse congregation, and I will tell you we are a very politically diverse congregation. I have very strong opinions about certain political things. You know how often I talk about them? Hardly at all, except in the kitchen with my wife. And only for a short time, she doesn't really care. Try not to talk about them much. We had a study with a lady, and she brought up political matters. You know what I did? I said nothing, despite the fact I vehemently disagreed with her. I said nothing. We ended up baptizing her. I still haven't said anything about it. I left it alone. Why? I have every right before the Lord to have opinions and strong opinions about some of the things that are happening in our culture and society. And some of those opinions are certainly rooted in Scripture for relationship to what is right and wrong. Some of them are just rooted in, I believe, wisdom gained through living a few years. Not as many as some of you, but a few. You hit your 40s, you're allowed to say that, right? You lived a few years. But I know I have to keep my mouth shut sometimes. Because it's not really about me in the end, is it? If I make my argument for why I believe this position is the best position, but I sever or cause great harm to a relationship with my brother or sister in a matter that is not eternally determinate, have I gained anything? Sometimes congregations divide over such foolish things. Brethren get all upset with each other over such foolish things. And Paul says, in matters of discretion, where it's not something that commends you to the Lord, or we'd have to add condemns. In context here, he's talking about food commending to the Lord. Now, food can condemn in gluttony, but that's not what he's talking about. It says you need to be mindful of your brother. Love edifies. You're going to seek to do what is best to have a good relationship with one another and to build each other up and not to cause your brother or sister to stumble. If we're going to love and sacrifice in love, we have to learn to be willing to sacrifice certain privileges for the sake of our brothers and sisters. Now, chapter 9 leads right into that. Because in chapter 9, we go to self-denial for salvation's sake. And so Paul, having talked to them about the meat offered idols, now brings himself into the picture. And he says, hey, brethren, I want you to understand something. I want you to understand why I conducted myself the way I did. And this seems to be linked to chapter 8, but also seems to be based in another question or another issue. Because at verse 3, he'll say, my defense to those who examine me is this. And so this portion of Scripture is Paul applying the principles of chapter 8 in his own ministry and demonstrating that. But some of Paul's willingness to sacrifice and deny himself for the sake of the saints has caused some to doubt his apostleship. So he's going to give a defense of it. He's going to say, here's why I did what I did. And by implication, those who you are receiving who aren't doing this, they're actually taking advantage of you. Self-denial for salvation's sake. So first his apostleship. The first two verses. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. So verse 3, obviously he's being questioned, but here he says, listen, Jesus has called me. In the very fact that you heard me and you saw me and you believed, you're evidence of my apostleship. You know. So in other words, the very idea that they would buy into someone questioning his apostleship, Paul says, is foolishness. I've been called by Jesus, and you coming to Christ through all that my preaching and through the signs and wonders I did amongst you is evidence of me being an apostle. So the whole argument, in essence, is foolishness. But the argument is rooted actually in Paul's self-denial. And so let's look at how he defends himself. In the first place, he defends himself by appealing to the example of others. Verse 4, do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? So you see what he says? He says, we have a right to our necessities. The other apostles, they're not laboring in the world. They're being supported by the church, is the implication as you get into the chapter here. They have a family that they need to care for, and the church is making sure they have what they need. Am I and Barnabas somehow or another some rare exception to this rule? My defense is this. Look at the other apostles. They're supported by the church. Shouldn't Barnabas and I and our labor for the Lord be supported? The example of others, the other leaders. But also, verse 7, other laborers. So his defense is the example of others, the other church leaders and other laborers. Notice verse 7. Whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock. The leader of a people who goes to war for his people expects the support of his people, doesn't he? Expects his people to come to arms, to provide the necessities in order to make that happen. Well, he says, what about the shepherd tending to his flock? He expects to be able to drink of the milk, doesn't he? What about the vineyard owner who plants the field, a vineyard? Doesn't he expect to be able to eat of the fruit that is born? The one who labors in the vineyard or labors as a shepherd expects to receive from his laboring for his provision. Well, you see where Paul's going with this, right? The apostles labor in the word and are provided by the church, just as any other labor is provided by virtue of the fact of what they're laboring within. Well, is there any difference for me? So that's the first part of his defense. Then he gives a second defense. The laws of God are on my side. Verses 8 through 14, he quotes the law of Moses here in verses 8 through 10. Do I say these things as a mere man, or does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about, or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partakers of this hope. So he quotes Deuteronomy 25:4, which, by the way, he also quotes in 1 Timothy 5 at verse 18. The concern that Paul says here when God gave this law wasn't for the oxen, though God cared for the oxen. That wasn't his primary point for giving it. Paul's argument is, does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written. God was implanting a concept for Israel. A laborer is worthy of his hire. The oxen who treads out the grain, don't muzzle him. As he's doing that work to provide that and to grind that, let him eat a little bit as he goes. Don't hold him back from the fruits of his own labor. And Paul says that's written for our benefit. The law of Moses says it. It is there ingrained for us. But not only is it the law of Moses, but verses 11 through 14, which was already hinted at in verse 10, it's the law of sowing and reaping. And Paul's argument here is that the physical help from the church is nothing compared to the spiritual benefits that they are reaping. The two in valuation are distinctly different. They can't even be on the same page, really. You can't put enough physical goods on the scale to begin to measure up to the spiritual benefit that the brethren have received. And yet Paul's not taking advantage of them. We're going to get to that more. He's not taking advantage of them, and no one who would labor in the word that the church provides for should take advantage of the church. But notice what he says. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Who are the others he's referencing here? He doesn't get specific into it, but if you just think about your own life, there are plenty of people who take advantage of the labor that you give in life, right? I mean, numero uno's the United States federal government. Right after that's going to be your state government, and right after that's going to be your local government. All of them, they're going to take a piece of the pie, aren't they, on the way down? The Corinthians had to pay taxes. Rome had taxes. Corinthians had to pay all kinds of taxes. They had to pay things just like we have to pay. There's a reason why Paul writes to the brethren at Rome and tells them taxes to whom taxes are due. They had other people in their life who would take from their labors. And Paul says, but we're sowing spiritual things amongst you. Is it a small thing for us then to reap the physical, the law of sowing and reaping? Nevertheless, he says, the end of verse 12, we have not used this right, but endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. For some reason, Paul had decided amongst the church at Corinth, it was not a good idea for him to receive pay, if we will, physical provisions from the church at Corinth. Now, if you read the letter to the Philippians, if you read Philemon, who, by the way, is associated with the church at Philippi, they had provided for Paul from the beginning. They were with him in the good times and in the bad times. They provided for him. Paul will reference that later when he writes to the Corinthians. It says, have I robbed other churches to take care of you? So he was being supported. Yes, he also did tent making and other things, but he was being supported. But for some reason in the situation in Corinth, he withheld himself from that. He denied that. He said, I had this right, but I exercised self-denial. Now, why did he do that? We'll get to that. But let's finish this thought first. He says, verse 13, do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple? And those who serve at the altar partake of the offering of the altar. Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach a gospel should live from the gospel. So Paul's apostleship is questioned because he has chosen not to take this from the Corinthians, and yet the Corinthians, Paul says, would owe it to him. He says there's no doubt in this. God has said specifically, those who, verse 14, it's pretty clear, The Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. Just like those who served at the temple. How were the Israelite priests cared for? By the offerings, right? The priests serving at the temple, a portion of those offerings went to the priests for them to feed themselves and their families. Paul references that, doesn't he? The temple and the altar. He says this is the way God has always functioned. Those who sow in spiritual things, it's a small thing for them to reap in the material. It was true of the temple and the altar. It's true of the church as well. But let's get back to this point of self-denial. Why did Paul deny himself in this instance? Well, I'm going to suggest to you verses 15 through 18 exemplify it. He says, I did it for the gospel's sake. We've referenced several times how things at Corinth are, well, they're not great. The city around it it's one of those cities we described last night like New York, right? You can go there, you can find anything, do anything. People think they can become anything there. That was the spirit of Corinth. And all of that is pressing in on the church. And with all of the idolatry and all the temples and all the temple taxes and all of the abuses of those people by the so-called religious people, I'm going to suggest to you what Paul says here in essence is, I saw the environment at Corinth, and in order to make sure the gospel stood out from the rest of that pagan foolishness, I denied what was rightfully mine to have for the sake of the gospel. Let's read these verses. But I have used none of these things, nor I have written these things, that it should be done so to me. For it would be better for me to die than anyone should make my boasting void. Well, Paul, what boasting? What have you been boasting in with the Corinthians? Verse 16, for if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel, for if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, I've been entrusted with a stewardship. What is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. Paul says, make my boasting void. What's my boasting? My boasting ultimately is that I have preached the gospel willingly. I've been a steward of God, and I've done all of this without charge. I have not abused my authority. Y'all ever pay attention to any of those televangelists? They get on TV and tell you they need a new private jet. Y'all, you know the kind I'm talking about, right? You ever see any of the news stories about Joel Osteen and his church group and all the money that pours into that and all that? You ever see any of that? America has our own wolves fleecing sheep, right? We do. And everywhere you go in the world, you will find someone appealing to some kind of religious authority in order to take advantage of people. You find it seems like it's across all cultural boundaries in every place. We ran into an individual one time in Hampton. I don't know where this guy is now. He had immigrated here from Africa, and he was some kind of famous / come to find out infamous evangelist. He wasn't a member of the Lord's church. He was some denominational person with a ton of different, but he wanted us to support his work, and he had a whole binder of all the things he had done while he was in Africa. For some reason, he had to leave Africa, come to the U.S., and what he wanted was us to help him get started so that he could build out his empire again. So he could do all this work again in America. He was like, you need the gospel too, and I want to give it, and here's my work, and I want... He wasn't trying to do the good work of the Lord. I was personally involved in those conversations and meetings with him. Became very apparent what he was looking for. He wanted money. And he wanted to use that money to build back up the kind of audiences, the kind of following that he once had when he was in Africa before he came to the U.S. That's what he wanted. Every culture, every place has its religious people who will try to take advantage of the people around them. It happens. And in Corinth, it was the pagan idolatry, the temples, and all the practices of it. And Paul knew it. And so Paul said, when I came, I wanted it to be my boast that I preached the gospel without charge. In a city where everyone was asking for a dime, Paul never asked for a single one, so that the gospel could be magnified. So Paul lays out there is a biblical and scriptural cause, yes, for why I could say you ought to pay me, why you ought to give me of the physical things for my needs. But in your instance, I refuse that. I exercise self-denial because I love you, I love the gospel, and I wanted to see salvation. Because ultimately, Paul, man, he was trying to serve all men. Verses 19 through 23, notice Paul's submission to men. He says, for though I am free from all men, I've made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. To the Jews I became a Jew, that I might win Jews. Those who are under law is under law, that I might win those who are under law. To those who are without law is without law, not being without law to God, but under law to Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now I do this for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. You think about Paul at Mars Hill in Acts 17. I referenced it last night. Just bring it up again. That sermon was very different than Stephen's sermon in Acts 7. Stephen's preaching to the people of God prior to the coming of the age of Christ, preaching to Jews, Israelites. And that sermon looks mighty different than what Paul does at Acts 17 when he's preaching to the Gentiles, the pagan, idol worshipers. If we want two sermons of apostles, well, you could take Acts 2, right? And lay that alongside Acts 17. And you see the difference in the sermons. Acts 2 is filled with quotations of the Old Testament. Acts 17, not so much. Paul in every place didn't change his message, but he did say, I came into the culture, I came into the society and understood it and sought to reach them in a way that would appeal to them. Sometimes we can be bad at that. Sometimes you'll see congregations that were planted in a certain place, and as the community and the city around them changes, they don't change. One of the biggest areas this has been a problem for the Church of Christ has been in racial issues. Churches planted in the city was all white and everything. Over time, the dynamics of the city, the demographics shifted around the congregation. Suburbs filled with the white folk. African Americans were moving into the city around it, and the church didn't change. They wouldn't reach out to that community. We're not going to have anything to do with them. They got the black church. They can go to them. Then you know what ends up happening, don't you? The doors of that church close. They die. Why? Well, they probably deserve to die because they weren't godly to begin with if they say we won't reach these people. But that's the point, isn't it? Paul said, wherever I go, I don't care who they are. I just want to reach them with the gospel. And if that means to the Jews, I become as a Jew, and to those who are without law as without law. In other words, when he was around the Gentiles, he wasn't worried about observing Jewish traditions. He wasn't worried about the washing of hands and everything. But I guarantee you, when he was with the Jews, he'd wash his hands. He would observe some of the purification rituals. Why? Because it didn't matter. There's nothing inherently wrong or good about that. It was fine. I'll do that so that I don't offend the Jews, so I can reach them with the gospel. Amongst the Gentiles, that's not going to be necessary. So in Corinth, Paul said self-denial for salvation's sake. In Mars Hill, self-denial for salvation's sake. When he's amongst the Jews, self-denial for salvation's sake. That's why he ends up at the temple and arrested later in the book of Acts. If we're going to talk about being those who are sacrificing in love, 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 9 go together. 1 Corinthians 8, Paul says to the brethren, You need to be willing to lay aside something that you could rightfully have for the sake of your brother if it's not a matter of commendation before God, if it's not something that is necessary before God. 1 Corinthians 9, you've questioned my apostleship. Look, I did exactly what I taught you in Acts 8. I did that. I laid aside something that actually was my right before God, but in this instance, I didn't have to take because it was more important for me to save you. More important for me to reach you with the gospel. And if you read verses 24 through 27, it's because he is striving for a crown. He's running with diligence, verse 24. He's running with a specific goal in mind, verse 25. And he's running with absolute self-control. He knows how to live rightly before God, verses 25 through 27. So let's get into chapter 10. We don't have but a few minutes left. So let's get into chapter 10. So this sacrifice, Paul lays it out in Acts 8. My brother. 1 Corinthians 8. I keep going back to Acts. 1 Corinthians 8. In 1 Corinthians 9, he says, look, I lived it. I lived it. 1 Corinthians 10, now let me show you someone who didn't. Let me show you folks who indulged themselves and lost their reward. It says, I want you to see Israel's failure. The first 5 verses of chapter 10, Paul enumerates Israel's blessings from God. He says, they're under the cloud, passed through the sea, baptized unto Moses, ate the same spiritual food, drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock, verse 4, that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But God wasn't well pleased with most of them, verse 5, their bodies fell in the wilderness. Now we know most is basically all, right? But not all, because we have 2, right? Joshua and, y'all remember the other one? Caleb, yes. See, Caleb often gets forgotten, doesn't he? Joshua ends up leading as a book named after him. Caleb sometimes gets forgotten. Joshua and Caleb, faithful servants of God. They don't follow the wicked spies' advice. They're on the side of the Lord in all things. They enter the promised land. So Paul's right when he says most, right? Most. I would count 99.9% as most. But they had all these blessings. And it's interesting, he references that rock that followed them being Christ. Christ, remember, the Word from eternity, become flesh. Christ is active in the Old Testament too. We don't have time to get in the study of the angel of the Lord and all that and how that might very well relate. But understand, Paul says Christ was with Israel in the wilderness. Well, by implication to the Corinthians, who was with them and who were they following? Christ. So there's a direct parallel Paul is drawing here. So what was Israel's problem? Well, ultimately it's unbelief. They don't trust God. Now that isn't explicitly laid out here with that language, but it is in Hebrews 3, 16 through 19. Especially the end of verse 19. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. So what was their unbelief? What was it related to? Their lust, their passion, their unwillingness to lay aside their desires to seek after God, but their embracing of their own desires and ultimately the denial of God. Verses 6 and following. These things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted, and not to become idolaters as some of them were. They lusted after evil things. Numbers 11 is filled with examples of it. Lusting for meat. All throughout the wilderness wanderings, they're lusting. But what about the idolatry? Paul takes that line directly out of Exodus 32, the foot of Mount Sinai. You know what you find in Exodus 32 at the foot of Mount Sinai? A golden calf. I've always loved Aaron's explanation. It just jumped out of there. I don't know how that thing came to be. Aaron, got to do better than that, buddy. Israel lusted. Israel turned to idolatry. And yet they had the same God and the same blessings that Corinthians have. They have the same God. They've been baptized unto Christ. That spiritual rock from which they drank is the same spiritual rock from which we're drinking. In other words, God was with them and He's with you. But their lust and their idolatry led them astray. So what do you need to take from that, Corinth? Well, Verses 12 through 33, Israel's failing is applied. First, you've got to guard against haughtiness. Verse 12, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Yes, flee idolatry. We'll read that at verse 14. But before he ever gets to the idolatry, he says to Corinth, you might look at Israel and think, we would never do like they did. There has no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. You are just as prone to falling to the same problems of lust and idolatry as they were. So if we're going to guard against a spirit that would cause us to not sacrifice in love for one another, deny oneself in love for one another, that would lead us away from God and to embrace things that we ought not to embrace, the first thing we have to guard against in that is haughtiness. Thinking, I've got it. Notice what Paul says, and if you get nothing else, because we are running out of time here, if you get nothing else out of this, I really want you to see what he says here. In verse 13, no temptation is overtaking you, but such as is common to man, but God is faithful. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able. Think about Matthew 6:13 and the model prayer, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Deliver us from the evil one. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. We talk about God won't give us more than we can handle. I like to put that a little differently. I say God won't give us more than we can handle with Him. Because if we leave Him out of the picture, there's going to be a whole lot of things that are going to be put before us that we can't handle. Because we're not relying on the one who can bless us and see us through it. But with Him, we're fine. With Him, we can handle it. But if we're haughty and we think we got it, God says, you won't. You'll fall flat on your face. But with me, you'll make it. With me, you can overcome it. And so you've got to guard against idolatry then. Verses 14 through 22. Don't provoke the Lord to jealousy. Don't share in the table of demons. Now, in their freedom to partake of the meat offered to idols or not, there's more that's said about this in this situation as we get to the end of the chapter here. But there is a concern that the apostle expresses that some of these who think they're all good, they can be around all of this without any issues, maybe aren't so good after all. Maybe aren't as strong in the faith as they think they are. Maybe they should be a little more willing instead of being puffed up with knowledge, thinking, oh, we know good, we've got this. Maybe they need to take a step back and be a little more careful in how they're thinking about it. But then at the very end of the chapter here, before long, you're going to want to eat some lunch. Notice verses 23 and following. He says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. This is what really links together chapters 8 through 10. So he brings back this idea again of something that is fine to do. It's okay, but it's not necessarily the best thing to do. It's not necessarily helpful, like the meat offered to idols and the eating of it. Verse 24, let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. Then he gives two different situations. One is about the marketplace. He says, buy and eat without asking questions to guard your conscience. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, verse 25, asking no questions for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. The meat belongs to the Lord anyways. Whether it's been offered to an idol or not an idol, nothing belongs to the Lord anyway. So just buy it, eat it, don't ask any questions for conscience sake. However, there's another situation. If any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no questions for conscience sake. Don't make an issue out of it. However, if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols. Well, can you eat something offered to idols, brother? Yeah, you can eat that. There's nothing wrong with it. Don't ask for conscience sake. So whether your conscience would be offended or not, just don't worry about it. Just eat. It'll be okay. But what if they bring it up? What if they bring it up? What if they're kind of trying to put you to the test a little bit? Seems to perhaps be the implication here because of what he goes on to say. Do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I seek to please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. And this verse, I have the next chapter anyways. This verse goes with this chapter. Imitate me as I also imitate Christ. You see how he brings all this together? This is what we start talking about in 1 Corinthians 8, and what we're talking about here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Whatever you do, do it to the glory of God. We have to be willing to sacrifice what we sometimes see as our right, as our privilege for the sake of one another. Sometimes we're going to have brethren who aren't as strong in a matter, and there's a variety of things that we could talk about in that. I mentioned earlier the idea of eating in the church building, which maybe isn't as common today as it once was, but I still encounter it. Maybe that's because a good chunk of my family that identify with the church on my mom's side are all still part of those churches. Still encounter that kind of thing. The politics seems to be really the heavy hitter nowadays. That when the world gets rid of the Lord, they got to find something to place their hope in. And they're placing their hope in a political solution, not in a divine one. So it doesn't surprise me. But these matters where it's not a matter of salvation, as we sometimes say, but the way Paul put it was it's not commending us to God. In other words, it's not something God has said, you need to do this to be right before me. If it's not something God has said, you ought to do this in order to be right for me, I need to not be arguing about that. I need to leave those things alone. I need to not be causing conflict. And there can be better unity in the church when we decide that the things that matter are the things of the Lord, and a lot of these things in the world that we argue about really don't matter that much, except for Duke basketball. We had a conversation earlier. I'm joking about that. And by the way, they beat the Tar Heels last night, so I am very happy today. Sacrificing in love, brethren. Don't make it about you. Look at the example of Paul and make it about the kingdom and the salvation of souls. That's really the message. Worry about your brethren getting to eternity. Worry about the lost seeing the Lord. If we make those two things our primary concerns and we sacrifice in love accordingly, man, we'll be a whole lot better in the body and in our works beyond the body if that's the kind of attitude we have. So I hope that's a help to you.